Introducing Matt. He's got a very amazing story. You can probably tell because a lot of his former colleagues are coming out to hear his story, and I think you're going to be inspired. So Matt is a UI UX designer. I always think, I work in marketing and advertising, and I always think of UI UX designers as graphic designers that work on the web. And that's not really true. It can be, and sometimes that's what it is. But I think what you're going to learn from Matt today is that it's so much more than that, and so much more possibilities can come from it. And so, Matt, welcome to the stage. Thank you for speaking today.
Yes, design can be so much more than graphic design. This talk is called For Patients by Patients. One of the things that you may not know is that people living with diabetes maybe don't love to be called patients. They might rather be called people with diabetes. Person-first language is sort of starting to take off. But before we get too far into that, I'd like you to meet Hazel. So Hazel was a happy, extroverted, 1.5-year-old baby who was well on her way. She's there in the back, hiding somewhere. She was well on her way to being the easiest of my 3 daughters to raise. We really thought we were going to squeak out with just the last one being super easy. When she started peeing way more than usual and refilling her water bottle at night 2 or 3 times, my wife remembered something from a Babysitter's Club book about how this might be a symptom of diabetes. So she started gathering data to rule it out. It probably wasn't diabetes. We should just watch it. 3 attempts to get our pediatrician to see us later. Don't take your kids to folks here in Pasadena. She refused to see us. She was wrong. Hazel was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the urgent care down the road at Huntington. Her blood glucose was 500, and she was beginning to be in the first stages of ketoacidosis. So you might have heard of keto diets. When your body can't get sugar, because in type 1, which is very different from type 2, your immune system has attacked your pancreas and attacked in particular the cells that produce insulin. So insulin is critical for your cells to be able to pull blood sugar out of your blood and use it to run the machinery of your body. So when this happens, your body kicks in and says, we're starving. Liquidate some fat stores. We need more sugar in the blood, which dumps more sugar into the blood, which it still can't get to. So one byproduct of that is ketones. They're acidic. Once your blood goes acidic, your organs can start to fail, and you can die quite quickly. It's a very serious condition. So we were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I knew nothing about it. So I pulled out my phone and started Googling. I saw nothing but stories about do-it-yourself, hardware hackers, diabetics hacking their pumps, and I was like, what? I can't deal with this right now. So fast forward, we went to Children's Hospital, and we began our process of learning about this disease. So I didn't know anything about it. I'm not going to assume you know anything about it. The best way that I can explain what it's like to live with type 1 is that you're always 20 minutes away from a coma. Because it has the same name as type 2 diabetes, it very often feels like it's a thing you can ignore. You can take a pill and you're fine. Managing type 1 is a practice that you have to engage in every day, multiple times a day, often every hour. Because if you're essentially filling in for your body to manage your blood glucose and keep it within range. If you go too low, you can go into a coma and die, or suffer a brain injury. If you go too high, it's a little bit less dangerous in the short term, but you're doing cumulative, any time spent above 140, you're doing cumulative damage to your organ systems, to your body. This is why it's common to see people in their 50s with type 1 going blind, having retinopathy, losing feeling, and all the things you associate with type 2 in terms of long-term complications. So with Hazel being diagnosed so young, we sort of feel like it's our job to sort of not destroy her body until we hand it off to her at 18. And it feels a bit like someone has said, okay, you have to play a board game, and I hate board games, by the way. You have to play a board game, and you have to play it about every 20 minutes, 24/7, and it involves math, and if you get it wrong, a person that you love could die. So, bye. Congratulations. Good luck. we had a really good pediatric endocrinologist and an even better clinical diabetes educator named Chris. She was a straight-talking New York nurse who we talked to on the phone every day, and she helped us begin to learn this practice. And I use that term very intentionally. It is a practice. Learning to manage diabetes is more like learning to play the cello than it is taking a pill or doing another clinical intervention. And as we started to get the tools to do this, we got an insulin pump, we got a thing called a continuous glucose monitor, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later. As you got these tools, at first we felt relief and then disbelief. So I'm 10 years into a career as a UX, UI designer, as a product developer, and I think big picture about how things work and how they're designed to work, and I have trouble accepting things that don't work well. And so, just so you don't think like I'm being a fussy designer, because designers are very particular about how things look and work. This is an example of the kind of problem. Let's see, it's not playing. Oh, it's just slow to start. There we go. So there's no audio here. This is me. This is a remote control for an insulin pump, the first pump we had, and this is the first hourglass. Keep count. So this is an interaction that you would do 5, 6, 12 times a day, if not more. Anytime you need to input what blood glucose might be and use the calculator. So this is trying to help you calculate what your dosing should be, because it's actually quite a complex bit of math. And this is me inputting a number that's sometimes in the 2, 3, 400s with a rocker switch, up, down, in increments of 1. Now, some blessed programmer put a long press interaction into that, but the speed of the scroll on the long press is inhumanly fast. It gets worse. So this is inputting the insulin. This is the critical medication that you have to get the dosing right. Look at the long press on that. Wait, no, too high, too low. Now, this is funny if you do it once. And do it 12 times a day. Do it at night when you just woke up. This is a huge problem. And this is one device in a suite of tools that we were using to manage this care. And at first I was angry, and then I was frustrated, and then I started trying to analyze, how did we get here? Another device is this amazing life-changing device called a Dexcom CGM. There's other CGMs. But the core of it, what it does is it replaces what you might think of as the main interaction of diabetes, which is pricking your finger, drawing blood, measuring that blood sugar. This puts a wire under your skin in your fatty tissue and measures your interstitial fluid, and gets every 5 minutes, it pings out a Bluetooth signal to a phone or to a receiver and says, here's what your blood glucose is. They've been getting better and better, and this G6 is the latest one, is amazing. We don't have to prick Hazel's finger unless something is going wrong or something is causing us to doubt the data in the device, and that's maybe once a month. My wife is shaking her head. How often? How would you say? A couple times a week. So that's down from you can see who's really driving the practice in our household. So this is a huge benefit, but in a project that I did last year, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later, we talked to, we surveyed over 100 people. We talked to 10 in depth. We couldn't find anyone who didn't love this device that was still using it, and we couldn't find anyone who also hadn't had serious relational or interpersonal consequences from using this device. This device is designed to wake you from sleep if you're going low and you live alone and you're going low in danger of dying, and so it will beep really loudly. The receiver that it's tied to, and that's a good thing if it's waking you from sleep and saving your life. But if you're in a meeting or on a date or at a theater or an event like this, it's less of a good thing. And then your spouse might say, "Oh, what does that mean?" Or I literally was in a meeting with Jim one time, and out of concern for this newly diagnosed child of mine, he heard my phone beeping because there's a nice follow app where I could have it remotely, and we stopped the meeting and says, "Is Hazel okay? Did you need to go?" As nice as that was, it was one more way that diabetes was interrupting my life and putting me out of control. And this idea of control and who's driving and who owns the choice, who is the agent or the actor, is actually something I hope you will really take away from this talk. Because it's, I think, the key question to ask when you're making devices to solve problems for people. So as a designer, what's my diagnosis? The diagnosis here, why are these devices so poor in my experience, has to do with a stakeholder problem. So anytime that you go to make a new thing, you have to ask yourself whose opinion matters, who gets to count, right? So, and good user-driven designers want to start with the person living with the problem. So this is person living with disease, little head, little shoulders, and then you might add in, another stakeholder. Maybe you add in a clinician. They should probably have a say too, because this is a medical device. And we should probably also add in regulatory, because we want this to be proven to be safe. We should probably add in the lawyers too, because we want this to be a sustainable business. And we should probably also add in maybe engineers should be here too, because we got to build this thing. So I feel a little bit outnumbered, but regulatory is more than just one person. This is a pretty big agency that has a lot of power and a lot of force. It turns out all of these have a lot of power. And pretty soon, this voice of the person living with the disease who understands the problem in their guts in the middle of the night, it's very easy for that voice to get lost. Last year, I took part in something called Disrupt Diabetes. This is me and 3 of my friends, and then just a random person this guy was on a video call with who joined the photo. Disrupt Diabetes was a design challenge hosted by Stanford Med School on the premise that of asking what could happen if we took a person with diabetes. This is Mabel. She's 15, been living with type 1 for 3 years. I brought my own experience as a diabetes dad, and then a clinician and a designer, and started asking questions about how might we solve some of these problems. It was an amazing experience because it was really recentering the design process on the people living with the disease. And the kinds of solutions we came up with were different than what's currently in the market. We focused on the CGM experience, the continuous glucose monitor, and we focused on redesigning that whole notifications experience to happen via haptics, via vibrations and the user's sense of touch. And we prototyped it. And we even have this lovely product roadmap to do. The product is called BG Aware, still is. We're currently at the stage of working on the Fitbit Watch version, but we'd love to do an Apple Watch version and ultimately a dedicated hardware device. Now, this project never would have happened, I would say, inside an existing incumbent company, because it wasn't prioritizing this is really about an insight that comes from the experience of living with these devices that somehow is getting lost or diluted in these stakeholder conversations. So incidentally, I do need some help on this. I'm coming up on the end of my window to finalize the provisional patent that I applied for last year. So if anybody has good patent legal help, I'd love to chat with you after. But the where this ends is, I felt like I had found my people. So we had been in the type 1 community for a while, and it's as diverse as the population because it cuts across all of it. These are the 2 young women who organized that event. And I found people who were, in the face of this grueling disease and this really poor design given to us to deal with it, who were not accepting that and were instead pushing back on that. And it's a really powerful experience to find the people in the community who are doing what you aspire to. So some of you might have heard of We Are Not Waiting. It's a hashtag. I and my friends in Disrupt Diabetes were not the first to have this experience. In fact, about 10 years before us, there was a group of people began meeting in the Bay Area, and they almost all of them live with type 1, had it in their families, and were frustrated that, yes, the CGM existed, but there was no way for them to follow it remotely. Yes, the CGM and the pump were giving this information, but all of the decision-making was happening still with the person, and no one had connected these devices together. And they started working on bridging these pieces together. So, as you might expect from a do-it-yourself open source project, this is one of the first iterations. You're looking here at a Raspberry Pi, little Linux computer, running on a battery pack, connecting to the Dexcom receiver, talking to using USB to talk from the Linux box to control the pump. Now, this involved reverse engineering this pump to be able to both send pump commands via radio frequency from the care link and also to be able to query the pump and get data off of it. Now, this built on prior work by people who just wanted the data off their pumps. The pump ends up being this big data island with all of your information on how much insulin you gave, how many carbs you entered, and yet there was no good way to get it off in a format that was manipulable and queryable by people who wanted to understand their disease better. The next step was a hero and now a colleague of mine at Tidepool, Pete Schwam, who's a diabetes dad like me and a mobile developer, taught himself circuit design and took those reverse engineered commands and built a radio frequency board that does two-way translation comms between Bluetooth low energy from a phone and radio frequency control of this pump. So now you have the ability to give commands to a pump via phone and to query the pump via phone. And it wasn't long after that we get to the product I'm going to talk about next. So, but getting back to our stakeholder. So here's lonely stakeholder. We might put lonely stakeholder in a box or in a community. And this boundary is here to describe like literally pushing all those other stakeholders outside for a little while because their interests and their goals are actually not aligned with our interests and goals at this point. Like, we couldn't get to the kind of product design or we couldn't imagine the kind of design and interaction that we wanted with those people pushing in. So we had to exclude them for a while. And then we had to join together with other people who were also living with this problem and contribute to a solution. Now, this is hard to build a business, right? Because you're sharing your code on the internet. It's on GitHub. Everybody's contributing. Maybe somebody's like leading, but it's messy, right? It's hard to build a business on open source software. But this open source software ultimately was able to be distributed to people, and people were able to choose to opt in. And this is critical, right? Like, no one builds this for anybody else. So these people had to decide if this was worth the risk, if the benefit of this new interaction with their disease was worth the risk of trying out this new code. So Loop was ultimately the product that came out of that is one of three. Dana Lewis, who did that first rig that I showed you before, is still doing OpenAPS. That's a Linux-based tool. You have to use a command line interface to do it. So if you know command line, you're good. If you don't, you're going to have to learn it. There's an Android branch of OpenAPS called Android APS that's really robustly being developed and works really well with a lot of pumps that are available in Europe. But Loop works on iOS, and it was designed by a person named Nate Rackleft, who lives with Type 1 and who was simply tired of waiting for pump companies to use this supercomputer that he was holding in his pocket to help him manage his disease. So he built it himself, partnering with Pete, building this interaction. And what you see here is this is beautiful representation of glucose, active insulin, insulin delivery, and active carbohydrates all right there. Here's how much insulin is there. And what you're going to see here on these boxes, so imagine the baseline is how much insulin the pump pushes on its own. So it's called basal insulin. Every time you eat a meal, you have to calculate a bolus, which is like a big chunk of insulin that you're pushing. So what this tool does is every 5 minutes, it reads that CGM data, and then it keeps track of how many carbs are on board because you told it. You announced the carbs that you ate as best you could estimate. And then it adjusts the basal insulin up and down every 5 minutes to steer you back into range. You can also set different ranges, different target ranges for different times of day and different activities. Now, when I describe this to you, it sounds obvious, right? Like this is a thermostat. Like as it starts to go up, the insulin goes up. As it starts to go down, the insulin goes down. But no one had made this. No one was willing to take the risk. No one was willing to fight through the regulatory battle. No one was willing to put in the work. And I can tell you, like, I will never forget the moment that we set this up for our own family. After being really nervous and doing our own validation tests, and our friend Aaron saying, like, Matt, you got to be careful with this open source software. Like, we need to set up some real good scientific testing, which we did. And we started watching this happen. So we sleep upstairs from Hazel. She was asleep at night. This is a visualization here. These are the blood glucose numbers, and this is sped up in time. But this is the system automatically adjusting that insulin up and down. As she starts to go up, it raises the insulin. As she starts to go down, it cuts the insulin off. The job that we had been doing every 2 hours, every 3 hours, all throughout the day is now being done every 5 minutes, and by a robot that doesn't get tired and doesn't get bored with it. And we sat there crying because we could finally breathe. It's hard to overestimate like how much this changed our life. And yet, the only way that we could get it was that we were clever enough to find out how to get the code. We were facile enough with Xcode to build the app. We were social engineering enough to find an insulin pump of this very particular vintage by tagging all of our friends on Facebook and having them share it with all their friends. I think it went to over 600 people. It's not available to everyone. So this is a little diagram I drew to explain the complexity of this dance here. But what it really gets to is all this data is running, but it's also shareable. Like I have Hazel's information on my watch right now. She's about 1:14. That was 3 minutes ago. So great for the people who can get it. What about the rest of us? So about a week after I set this up, I got a cold Facebook message from a high school classmate, always the best. And this message said, "Hey, Matt, my 11-year-old was just diagnosed with type 1. Someone from our class told me you invented some system that's going to manage it for me. Can you give it to me now?" I'm haunted by that request. I tried to explain, like, here's the docs, you can read them. He's not going to be able to make it. Even if he can get a pump, which are increasingly difficult to get of this kind, that hasn't been patched to disable this ability, setting it up, running it, troubleshooting it is going to be beyond his reach for now. So how do we get from an open source project to an FDA-regulated product that you can download in the App Store? And that's where Tidepool comes in. So Tidepool.org is our website. Tidepool is a software nonprofit in the diabetes space. You heard me right, folks, nonprofit. So when the two co-founders, Howard Look and Brandon Arbeiter, Brandon lives with type 1, Howard's daughter has type 1. When they went to their venture capitalist friends in the Bay Area, they talked to one in particular at a firm called Venrock, and his advice was, look, if you want to make a new diabetes innovation and get acquired and get sort of sucked up into that same ecosystem, then do a startup and do it for profit. Like, you can probably make something happen. But if you really want to change the landscape for innovation in the diabetes space, if you want to push on those forces that were pushing back on the voice of the person living with the disease, you got to do a nonprofit. So what can you do as a nonprofit? She's not laughing at me, folks. She's watching YouTube. One thing you can't do is that you can't take investment for equity. But you can take donations. And I've actually been really encouraged to hear that we actually had several VCs just give us money as a donation because they're so excited about what we're trying to do. I'm going to go back to this slide here. So Tidepool, at its inception, we're 6 years old as a company, actually. And this product that you're seeing here is a retrospective data analysis product. The initial vision of Tidepool was to get that we believe that all patients' data belongs to them, even if it's made on other people's devices, and they should have access to that data because diabetes is a data management disease. So in some cases, through partnering with companies, we built a single place where you can upload all of your devices. The current state is every device ships with its own, oftentimes poorly built software that imports data to its own island of data. So, but you really need to see those three values that I showed you before to really understand your disease well and manage it better. And so Tidepool gave the ability for the first time for many folks, without having to have any DIY know-how or any ability to build and install a Heroku instance and set up a web server, the ability to have this data in one place. And we're still continuing to add devices every day. This product is there. It's also available for clinicians. It's free forever and always. It's funded by the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation and several other partners. Incidentally, it also gives people with the disease the ability to donate their data anonymized to researchers who are working for cure and to make the experience with type 1 better. So that's some of the things you can do as a nonprofit. Another thing that you can do is that you can open source your code. So many of the people who work at Tidepool came from this community who were contributing to these projects and were already, because they wanted these projects to actually impact people's lives. And so our commitment is that we continue to open source the code of the things that we make. So that might mean that someone could take our code and build some cool new product out of it. And that would be great. Because our goal is not just for us to succeed. Our goal is to actually make an impact on the quality of life of everyone living with this disease. So there are bounds on that. So if you are the person who shared your data and you don't want to share your data, if you just want it to be available to you, that's fine, and we respect that. If you're a partner with us and you have an SDK that you want to keep private, we don't open source that. So we're not crazy, but we are trying to share as much of our work as we can so that other people can continue to use it. Another thing that you can do, so this is our sort of announcement. Tidepool announced last year that we were taking Loop and bringing it through the FDA and making it available to everyone with a prescription, downloadable through the iOS App Store. And that is a project that we started last October, and I joined Tidepool to work on this project because Loop had made such a big difference in our life. So what else can you do as a nonprofit? You can remain a credible voice, convening a conversation with the FDA and other regulators on process and redesign. So remember those stakeholders that were pushing things in a direction that was maybe unhelpful. The old way of developing for the FDA is you do your R&D, you prototype out your project, you submit your proposal to the FDA, you might go through clinical trials to make sure that everything is safe, and then that, miracle of miracles, you're approved, your company does not go under, you ship your product, and then why would you ever touch it again? You've spent all this money and time to get this project and this product approved and proven safe, and now you're disincentivized from actually improving it. I'm convinced that's why that button is so bad, that button interaction. That software got locked after it got FDA approval. And even if you noticed it in user testing, you would not be allowed to fix it because it's simply too costly to go back through that process again. So one of the things that Tidepool did early on was we talked to consultants about how do you manage the FDA regulatory process. And to a person, everyone said, don't talk to the FDA. They'll destroy your company. It's all downside risk for you. Give them what they ask for and then walk away quietly and hope that you survive. So we called bullshit on that. And our CEO started reaching out to the FDA, started flying to DC, and started having meetings about what might it look like to have a process of regulatory approval, especially for software that has therapeutic value, that enables software to do what it does best, which is to iterate, while keeping the same regulatory power on the things that are life-threatening, that are serious. And so they started to lay out a plan for diabetes tech that looked like this. So the I stands for interoperability. So there should be an interoperability standard for a CGM. Dexcom has that certification from the FDA. There should be an interoperability standard for an alternative control enabled pump. This is the artist formerly known as the iPump. So the idea here is that a pump shouldn't be married to one control software. That in fact, that you should there should be an interoperability standard for pumps. There are several pumps who have received this certification. So far, there is no interoperability controller. Tidepool will be submitting for the first certification for that certification. So that this would be the first step towards an ecosystem where if you have a 3-year-old and you need a pump that's waterproof and small and fits into her life, then you can have that pump with the control that you want. And then as she gets older, maybe she actually wants to have a different pump that's a little bit more discreet, so she swaps that out. But she still gets to keep her control interface. She still gets to keep the CGM she wants to use. Maybe she gets a little bit older and she wants an even more discreet CGM. She can swap that out. That sounds really normal, right? You can buy Bluetooth headphones from any brand that you want and plug them into your iPhone. That is not the case for medtech and for diabetes. But that's the vision that we're trying to create and have taken steps to create. What else can you do as a nonprofit? You can partner with everyone. So this is our first public pump partnership. This is an Omnipod pump. This is a patch pump. No tubing. You slap it on just like the CGM, and it puts a cannula in your arm and delivers insulin for about 3 days, and then you take it off and you get another one and slap it on. And we are building a new version of Loop. So the old version you could think of as DIY Loop. This is Tidepool Loop, currently under development. Tidepool Loop is not currently being marketed or sold. But we are building this first to work with this pump, but we are in conversations with every pump company because we want to be swappable. And from our perspective, the pump is a digital syringe, and the real value is in the interaction design around how you manage this disease in the most low-friction way possible. So what other kinds of new approaches does a nonprofit approach, or this kind of patient-driven nonprofit approach have? What does it enable? Well, you can read more about this in our we've released the notes from our FDA meetings on tidepool.org, which are actually really informative if you want to hear about this new direction that the FDA is thinking about for digital therapeutics. But componentization is one of the ways that we talk about this idea of you should be able to say the insulin control algorithm is the most dangerous part of the system, right? How we dose insulin is a life and death matter. And that deserves FDA regulatory scrutiny, the highest level of rigor that we can provide to ensure that this thing is safe. Whether the buttons are rounded, what colors you use, those might actually impact the safety of that device, especially if they create confusion or not, but they also might not. And if we could get really granular about which parts of the interaction are the most critical to have the highest level of rigor and which things could actually be iterated more quickly, then that would enable software to do what is its superpower, which is to iterate and in a tight cycle of feedback with people who are using it. So that's one of the approaches that we've been pioneering. The other approach is to take this cohort of about 3,000 people. We have no way of knowing for sure, but there's been 4,000 Riley links shipped to unique addresses across the world. So we know that there's at least that many people who have the potential to be running Loop. And we've recruited from them, from that group, a study that the FDA is allowing us to use in lieu of what the traditional method of doing like a hotel study or like bringing people into a hospital setting with a small number and in a sort of artificial situation, and taking this real world data of people using the software in the wild, and we're using that as the foundation for our FDA submission. That is a new approach, and I would argue if you're looking for scientific rigor, study data from in the wild, provided you can validate that the sample roughly correlates to the population, which we're doing by comparing it with the T1D exchange data set. But study data from in the wild from kids like my daughter in the back of the room who go to events, who spill their drinks, who sneak strawberries from the refrigerator. If you can get real data from that kind of utilization, that's a better data set. So I want to zoom out a little bit further as I close this talk and head into the Q&A. But this is a quote from a person I spoke to in the course of doing user research. She says, in 30 years of living with type 1, I've never felt more helpless than when I was on that pump. And she was talking about the first attempt at a commercial hybrid closed-loop system. And this is a pump that just recently there was a study showing that about the significant number of the people who tried it out found that they didn't stick with it. And the overwhelming feedback was they didn't feel in control. The pump was doing some of the same automatic features that I showed you, but it was not obvious why it was doing what it was doing when, and it would kick people in and out of different modes. And the outcome was that she felt helpless. Like, this may seem like a small thing because it passed the FDA. Like, it probably was improving her A1C and other clinical metrics. But there is a tendency for us to focus myopically on narrow but conveniently measurable clinical metrics like A1C, like blood glucose time and range. And those things are critical and important, but those are table stakes. Like, that's just what you have to do to prove that your thing is actually working. The broader metric that you might want to consider is, does it actually empower the person. This is a quote from my friend Dr. Myung-Yoon Hammer, who's a medical family therapist and teaches at Fuller. When I was talking to her about this, she says, restoring one's own agency is the most critical task for people working to negotiate a healthy relationship with a chronic disease. This idea of agency, of who is driving, who is in control of this, because the disease has already put you on your heels and said, no, I'm in control of your life. And the path to long-term mental health with chronic disease is getting a sense back of that control. So that's where I want to leave you today, is do the people who use the things you make feel their power return to them? Because more than any other metric, if you're working in trying to create solutions for people living with disease, this might be one you might want to consider. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. That was amazing. So many questions, I'm sure. So we're going to pass the microphone around. I'm going to hand the mic to John. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Right now, we're not really looking for stories about your own personal diabetes journey. We're really looking for stories that we can learn from Matt. So here's the microphone, John.
Thanks.
So what we're looking at here is this is the loop interaction from an Apple Watch as compared to that other horrible remote experience.
Thank you so much. That was really incredible in so many different ways. So a couple of questions, but I'll limit to just one area around the ownership of your data.
Yes.
And how that works, as well as then working with these other companies.
Right.
How do you, are they incentivized to connect in with your whether it's an API or whatever? Like, are they actually incentivized, and why is that? Is it like herding cats, or do they actually want to work with you?
So data first, and then why would they partner with us? And what's their motivation? From a data standpoint, it's really simple. Tidepool was about 16 people last year and is now about 26, so we're scaling up to hire for this project because this has gotten a lot of interest from the kind of patient advocacy partners like the Helmsley Trust and Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. So, but prior to that scale up, it was a lot of developers, and I don't know if you know many developers, but they tend to be very privacy conscious because they know how the sausage is made. So it's built into our architecture that data privacy and data security are the choice of the user. But whenever we're offering an opportunity to share that data, let's say with your clinician, that we're very clear about what that offer is and who's getting the data and how. So in terms of what happens on our platform, on Tidepool, we have control of that. The question about it's a value and a priority for us, and that has really influenced a lot of the product decisions as we've gone into it. A lot of the questions have been around like the current version of Loop, for example, the DIY Loop doesn't require a patient account, doesn't require an account to sign up to use it. You just build the app, and then no one has the data but you. And we literally, I believe this would not have been a huge discussion in any other company, but we had a long discussion about whether we would actually still support that interaction model. Now, we ultimately need to be able to get in touch with you if there's an adverse event or if for any reason there's a recall or we need to let you know. So we are going to require an account. But we spent a good deal of time debating that. So just to give you a sense of what the company culture is like. Most of the people in our company either live with type 1 or themselves, or they have it in their family. So that really does shape a lot of the conversations. Why would the other companies partner with us? That's a great question. And I think that there was some skepticism at the beginning about whether they would. But honestly, it's a way for some of them to leapfrog the competition. Literally right now, I think that there's this grassroots movement of DIY artificial pancreas systems, and all the buzz and the news that it's gotten has pushed those patient voices louder in the face of the companies that are incumbents in the space. And they're all working on their own version of this. But they're doing it in their own way. And if we drew a map of the stakeholders, it's probably that same map. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider those stakeholder voices, but I'm saying that if you bring them into the product discussions and you let them create the scope of the problem space, you're prioritizing the wrong voices, and you're only going to get the same kinds of outcomes that you've gotten before. So I know some of them are interested in having Phone control, like that's a real value that is currently not available on the market. You can't control your insulin pump with your phone. Not available. There's lots of them in the pipeline for that. But this interaction model that's 3 years old for DIY Loop is really pretty mature as a DIY product. And if we can take that and roll it in, then it's just a huge leapfrog forward. And for many of them, it's just a small bet. Like they're doing their own sort of very large project in this space, but if they can put some money towards this and partner with us, then we'll see if it pans out. We think that it's more than just the interaction that we've designed, that it's just one more. We actually think because it comes from the grassroots, it comes from the lived experience of the disease, that our interaction is better. It fits better with the way that people living with the disease want to manage their disease. With more than just a myopic focus on time and range, but like how does it fit with my life? Does it enable me to go to my wedding and not be interrupted? Does it enable me to go to this job interview and not have alarms going off? Those kinds of questions.
Over here, Matt.
Yeah, my question, Matt, is what are some other areas where this sort of data-intensive kind of medical device, like where do you see this going into other diseases or other things? I'm just curious. Seems like it has a lot of broad.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you saw Tim Cook's recent talk. I believe it was at Oxford, and he was talking about wearing a continuous glucose monitor and all the amazing insights he got from that about what was happening with his body. My wife and I have both taken turns wearing one, and to my very pleasant surprise, beard had very little impact on my blood glucose. Chick-fil-A with a Coke kept me high for a long time. It's a combination of sugar and fat there. So I think that you're going to see CGMs and continuous glucose monitoring is going to become mainstream as soon as someone solves a way to do it without penetration of the skin. And then it's going to become as ubiquitous as a heart rate monitor. And once that happens, we're all going to be seeing what happens to our blood glucose when we drink this coffee with 2 sugars instead of 1. And it's going to start driving. It's part of the quantified self movement, I think. But I think what you can see in type 1 diabetes is this ongoing. We're sort of at the vanguard of what happens when you need in-body sensors and critical metrics to drive your behavior. Some people don't like the cyborg language, but I think we're some of the first cyborgs because we really need this tech and we've integrated it into our lives. So what I would say in terms of like how is the data that going to drive other products, I would say paying attention to even some of the what seem like minor things of like how many seconds does it take to interact with that interaction to dose. How discrete is it? How are you doing alarms and alerts? How are you dealing with alarm fatigue? How are you dealing with false positives? Those kinds of things actually become really, really critical when you start weaving technology into your body and into your life. And most of the traditional approaches for medtech do not prioritize the agency of the person. They prioritize other metrics.
Over here.
Tell me about the... Oh,
please.
No, you're next.
Tell me about the distribution of your staff and how many are full-time and how often you get together and how that all works out in terms of being a remote organization.
Wow, how did you know we were remote? You've been reading our website.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Tidepool's a remote organization. There was an office in the Bay Area for a while, but they made a decision early on that they could save a lot of money and hire the best talent globally. And a lot of that has been hiring talent from the DIY community. We have a lot of developers who contributed. I mean, it's a great way to interview, right? Like you work on an open source project with somebody and you see the quality of their code. So we have people in Australia, in England, all across the U.S., and we get together twice a year for 1 week at a time for a retreat. Next one's coming up at the end of this month. You guys can all express your condolences to my wife, who'll be managing diabetes solo that week. We normally trade off every other night who's responsible to get up with alerts and alarms to manage those issues. Incidentally, since setting up Loop, I would say we have to get up and do an intervention, a diabetes intervention, once or twice a week. He said yes, folks. With Loop, prior to that, it was virtually every night. It was rare for us to not have to get up every night. multiple times a night often. So that distributed workforce has been new to me. I used to drive into an office in Pasadena at Fuller, and I think what makes it work is that there is no home office. So everyone is distributed, so everyone's equal in that regard. All meetings happen online. And that's what that's enabled us to do, is to hire the best people wherever we can find them, which a lot of companies have moved towards. And it's not just about the best people. It's about the people who get this in their guts, who know what it is to wake up in the night, and that affects how we move this project forward.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thanks for your very insightful and stimulating and presentations. So like your last slides, you see trying to bring power to the patient or maybe to the users. So my question comes here is, what do you define the power? For example, is a simple interface or is a more flexible interface? Similar like I remember when I started to do the search address online, the first app I use is MapQuest because they give me, you can give lots of calculation about here. Later, Google also has the map search there. So generally, different people have different opinions about the power here, and how do you differentiate about different patients there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that we wrestle with inside of Tidepool as well. When I came on board and started arguing about, or started raising this concept of user agency as a critical value, people began to ask, are you talking about more buttons and more switches? Are you talking about more like offloading the cognitive load of the decision making to the user, because that's not necessarily empowering. And so what I would caution you is that it's not an easy one-to-one of saying more agency means rounded corners. More agency means more knobs and dials. It's really about the cumulative composition of what you have made and what that interaction, how that interaction is experienced and received by the user. And so a lot of that comes, you learn that through iterative testing. You learn that through, and critically, iterative testing with people who, this is obvious, but I spoke with a person just yesterday who left a company that works in this space, and she said they shipped a product that hadn't really been tested with very many people with type 1. And I was just blown away. That's literally your audience. And so there's not a one-to-one relationship of how you create patient agency and how you create the sense of being empowered. But if you are not attending to that outcome, then you run the risk of creating an experience that further adds to the sense of being disempowered. You are one more way, and your product is one more way that diabetes is taking your life away from you, or any disease. That's why I'm arguing for this, because whatever other clinical metrics that are important, if you aren't contributing to the sense of the person running their life, managing their disease, being the agent making the decisions, then you are adding to the problem in some way.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's really interesting and inspiring to hear sort of how you guys are building an organization based on the structures that are in place, like nonprofits working with the FDA, and how to kind of work within those structures to make something work.
Yes.
My question is actually related to the last one of, as a designer, how do you accommodate for the wide range of types of patients that you have and the demographics they belong to, whether they're age 2, 1.5, or age 65?
That's a great question. It's hard, right? Because as a designer, you want to tune into who's this for, and then really deeply understand them. I was talking to someone before this talk earlier and saying that this experience and even writing this talk and saying some of these things as starkly as I'm saying them is a bit of an identity crisis for me as a designer. I want to believe that the power of empathy can conquer any design challenge, and I just see it failing. Even well-meaning, really good designers who go out and do good user interviews still take weird turns, especially with others when you add in the extra stakeholders, but even on their own, because there is and I would say that the distinction is when what you are designing for is to enable a practice, that you must be engaging with practitioners of that practice. So I love my pediatric endocrinologist. We saw him yesterday at CHLA. He's great. He's been incredibly supportive of all of this craziness, which to him probably seems that way, although he actually sees it as the future, which I think is the right way to see it. But he doesn't live with type 1 diabetes. So if I want to understand how to do this, how to manage this disease better, he can tell me if I'm getting it right, but asking him for help is like if I'm a cello player and I ask the symphony conductor about my bow technique. He's not going to be able to help. I need to talk to another practitioner to learn that. So similarly, if you're designing a tool to enable a practice, yes, you need to understand the clinician perspective, you need to understand the regulatory perspective, but the people who actually know the practice are the ones who should be informing that design. And when you have a split between the parent caregiver role and the person with diabetes role, those are like two of the biggest distinct user experiences. And so one of the early discussions that we had as a company is when we decided to take on this project is, do we ship with an experience built for parents, or do we add that as like a V2? And what we decided was we're going to ship with that experience, because over 50% of the people who express interest in this product are parents, caregivers, which made me really happy, because the other thing I didn't really address here is that most of the design is oriented around the 20-something adult and onward living with type 1. Because why? Because that's the majority of the life cycle of that product. And so there's a lot of missed opportunities and weird UXs around the parent caregiver experience that you have to sort of use at the very core of it, you put a pump on a 3-year-old and you need to interact with that pump. So you're going to chase them around? They don't want to stop playing for you to bolus them for their lunch. So because right now I can reach into her pump through radio frequency control from this watch to her phone, and I can announce carbs, and I can bolus for those carbs. So it really does come down to paying attention to the people who are engaged in the practice, as diverse as they might be. And it is a hard challenge, but what we find is that by moving that interaction into a digital space like a phone, as opposed to a locked interface, it just gives you a lot more flexibility in what kinds of interactions you can support. Notably, coming into the Loop experience, which was designed by a 24-year-old developer for his own type 1 diabetes, it worked really well for a parent caregiver if I'm holding that phone. So some universal design can work well.
Thank you, Matt. Before you step down, let me get a picture of you. So actually step here. Have you? Good.
Yeah,
one quick last question. Is there anything that we can do? You've shared so much and your story is so inspirational. Is there anything, we've got a group of people here, innovators and entrepreneurs, is there anything we can do to help you?
Yes. You could look at the jobs page at Tidepool. We're an entirely remote distributed company, so it doesn't matter where you are. Location literally doesn't matter. And we have a couple positions open. We're looking for the best people. It's not a requirement that you have type 1 or have it in your family. And aside from that, that's a good question. The patent thing is entirely a me thing. So Tidepool's not doing patents because that's not the game we're playing. We actually want people to use our stuff. The BG Aware project is a thing I started before Tidepool. And so, yeah, I would love to talk to somebody about what makes sense for that moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you.